Good night. Tonight we'll spend some time together, lying side by side with the past. We're going to take a slow, quiet walk through medieval sleep. When comfort was scarce, warmth was fleeting, and the night was longer than you remember. We'll start at sundown, because in the Middle Ages, when the sun went down, so did you. We'll lie on rope beds and uneven floorboards, covered in furs or nothing at all. We'll whisper among peasants, packed into one smoky room. Then part a velvet curtain and peek into a noblewoman's chamber, where even featherbeds couldn't keep the cold out. We'll talk about segmented sleep, and what people did in the long hours between first rest and second. About who slept naked, who wore wool, and why no one ever had socks. And then, we'll face the beast that was winter. How they fought the dark, kept fires alive, and learned to sleep with their breath in mist. You'll hear the bells, the breathing, the rats behind the wall. And you'll understand why night was never just sleep, it was a time of dreams, fears, and prayers to wake again. And in the morning, they would rise slow and shivering, rubbing their eyes, and kindling what little warmth remained. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. That's the story I'm telling tonight. In a world before electricity, the night didn't arrive with a switch. It crept in slowly, with the lengthening of shadows across the floor, the quiet dimming of the sky, and the hush that settled once the last ember in the hearth began to wink. And so, in the Middle Ages, sleep came not because one was ready, but because the world had gone dark, and there was nothing left to do. For most people, especially peasants, bedtime was not a separate, sacred ritual. It was simply the end of labor. When your hands had done all the washing, mending, fetching, grinding, feeding, tending, and scraping they could do without light, you stopped. And stopping meant sleep. The sun was your schedule, and it rarely asked how you felt about it. There were no clocks to count down the hours. No gentle glow of streetlights to stretch your evening. No television to ignore. Just the rhythms of nature, seasonal, inescapable, and profoundly indifferent. In winter, dusk came early, sometimes by 4 in the afternoon. In summer, the last light could linger until nearly 10. Your body moved with it, tethered to light and shadow like the tide to the moon. But medieval sleep wasn't just earlier, it was different. They didn't sleep in one long stretch. That tidy little 8-hour block we call a good night's sleep is a modern invention, one built on factory shifts, electric bulbs, and the idea that rest must always be earned. In the Middle Ages, sleep came in 2 parts, what historians now call first sleep and second sleep. You'd drift off sometime after sunset, usually not long after the last bite of porridge or stale bread. This first sleep might last 3 or 4 hours. Then you'd wake. Not fully, just enough to notice the stillness. Some stayed in bed, dazed and blinking. Others rose quietly, shuffled across creaking floors, or whispered through the dark. The hours in between weren't wasted. They were used. For prayer. For checking the fire. For repairing a loose seam or visiting the outhouse, if you were brave enough to face the cold. If you were lucky, maybe you had someone beside you. And if you were really lucky, they were still warm. It wasn't cold insomnia. It wasn't even inconvenient. It was just how sleep worked. Expected, communal, and strangely tender. A pause between the body's first rest and its second surrender. Eventually, second sleep would come, slower, deeper. And you'd slip back into the dark until the cock crowed, or the bells tolled, or your youngest child rolled over and smacked you in the face. And still, no one called it sleep hygiene. No one timed their IM cycles. No one took magnesium or diffused essential oils. There were no silk masks or sunrise alarms. Just a very long night and a body that did its best. Of course, how you slept, and how well you slept, depended almost entirely on who you were, and where you laid your head. For peasants, nightfall didn't always mean peace. It meant finding space. In one room, sometimes the only room, you might have 6 to 10 people settling in for the night. Parents, children, a grandparent, a cousin, a newborn who wasn't yours. And not just people. Chickens roosted quietly near the hearth. Goats were tied inside during the cold months. A piglet might curl up behind someone's knees. Not because anyone thought it was sweet, but because everything that breathed gave off heat, and in winter, warmth was not optional. If you think your uncle snoring on the couch ruins your sleep, try it with livestock, lice, and a cousin who kicks in his sleep. And then try it again the next night. And the next. For the rest of your life. Privacy was not just rare, it was irrelevant. No one had ever expected it. You shared what you had, one blanket, often scratchy and patched. It passed from side to side, sometimes tugged back in the night without apology. Underneath that, you might have a mattress, if you were lucky. Usually stuffed with straw in the fall. Still holding the scent of harvest and dry grass. But by midwinter, flattened and gray. Not so much a cushion as a collection of whispers, poking through the fabric. And then there were the guests. Not the human ones. Fleas, lice, beetles, and the occasional worm. Once the mattress grew warm from your body, so did they. It was said that if your bed rustled on its own, you weren't alone, and no one thought that was funny at the time. The straw crackled under every movement, itching against your thighs, catching in your shift. There were no sheets to change. No weekly wash. Only the smell of old wool, damp skin, sweat, smoke, and time. You might keep your shoes beside you, not for convenience, but because rats would drag them away otherwise. And you might wear your day clothes to bed, not from laziness, but because no one had enough garments to dedicate one just for dreams. And this was summer. In winter, things got harder. We'll get to that later. Let's just say, for now, that sleeping through the cold was an achievement in itself. One that required ritual, grit, and a certain tolerance for frostbite. The only real luxury in a peasant's sleep was exhaustion. You didn't need peace. You just needed to lie still long enough. Let the body collapse. Let the muscles give up. Let the breath deepen. No one tucked you in. No one asked about your dreams. You closed your eyes, you hoped not to wake up colder than when you lay down, and you did it all again the next night. Not everyone had a bed. That's the first thing to understand. In fact, for many medieval people, especially the poor, the word bed didn't mean much more than a place where you lie down and try not to die of exposure. It could be a sack of straw, a cleared patch of dirt beside the hearth, a wooden bench in the corner, a pile of old cloaks, your own arm, curled awkwardly under your head, while your shoulder slowly goes numb. Technically, yes, you were sleeping. But it wouldn't be fair to call it comfort. Let's start with straw mattresses, since they were the most common bedding for rural families. These weren't plush or shaped. Just sacks, usually linen or hemp, filled with whatever straw or hay you could gather after harvest. Some used reeds or dried rushes, especially in marshy regions. But straw was popular because it was cheap, accessible, and gave the illusion of softness, until you lay down. Over time, the stuffing broke down. It compacted. It shifted to one side. And suddenly you were sleeping on burlap full of broken stems and dust, while one sharp stalk poked your back for 6 hours. You might try to shake it out or fluff it up now and then, but not too often, because removing the straw also removed all the tiny creatures living in it. And while fleas were universally hated, they were still considered better than sleeping directly on cold stone. Then there were pallets, thin bundles of straw, rushes, or even moss laid directly on the ground. These were less bedding, more formal permission to collapse. Some had no padding at all. If you were a servant, an orphan, or just unlucky that year, you might curl up on the floorboards or bare earth. And if you woke up sore and stiff, well, that was just how bodies aged. At 19. Benches were another favorite for the semi-respectable poor. Especially older men, who liked the idea of being off the ground even if their knees didn't. A wide wooden bench, maybe softened with an old cloak, served as both seat and bed. No one minded. The fire was nearby, and privacy was a luxury for city people anyway. Now, if you climbed a little higher in status, say, a prosperous merchant or a town official, you might have a proper frame bed. These were usually wood, often hand-built, with 4 legs and slats across the base. And if you were lucky, you got to sleep on the medieval version of a box spring, a rope lattice. Picture a wooden frame with ropes stretched across, woven tightly like a giant square hammock. This supported the mattress, usually filled with feathers if you were wealthy, or more straw if you were still pretending. The ropes sagged over time, of course, and had to be tightened regularly, which is where we get the phrase sleep tight. The more you tighten the ropes, the firmer the bed. And if you've ever tried tightening 20 feet of tension rope by candlelight with cold fingers while someone else is already lying on the mattress complaining, then congratulations, you have shared in the great medieval tradition of bedtime chores. Higher still, we enter the world of noble beds, where things get decadent, or at least theatrical. A noble's bed was often the most valuable item in the house, second only to land. Made of carved oak or walnut, draped in heavy curtains to keep out the cold and nosy servants, it stood tall and imposing, sometimes requiring steps to reach the top. The mattress might be stuffed with feathers, if you were noble, or horsehair if you were not quite noble but married well. On top, linen sheets, woven blankets, perhaps even imported wool or silk if you lived close to a trade hub. The bed was so central to wealth that it often appeared in wills, passed down like a title or estate. To own a feather bed was to declare yourself both powerful and vulnerable. Because if you could afford to sleep soft, you were important enough that people might care if you didn't wake up. But even among the wealthy, there were trade-offs. Feather beds trapped heat, which was great in January, but unbearable in summer. And they attracted lice just as efficiently as straw, though in slightly more luxurious circumstances. And the heavier the curtains, the more likely you were to inhale the same air for 8 hours straight. Freshness was not a medieval priority. And no matter what you slept on, one fact remained true: mattresses weren't personal. Beds were shared. By couples, children, guests, neighbors, servants. In some cases, even business partners traveling together. The idea of a bed for one person was laughable. If you were offered a mattress, you expected company. Maybe not the company you wanted, but someone was going to be breathing in your direction before the night was over. And that's not even counting the vermin. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were considered inevitable. Entire industries sprang up around nitpicking, literally. Mothers combed their children's heads with firelight. Wives examined their husbands' tunics. And the humble louse comb became as essential to morning routines as the chamber pot. So when we talk about medieval beds, we're not talking about sanctuary. We're talking about survival. A few hours of rest, if you were lucky. A sliver of warmth, if you had someone to share it. And a mattress that wouldn't collapse beneath you before spring planting. And still, you closed your eyes. You slept. Because the day had wrung you out, and the dark had taken over, and you didn't really have a choice. Sleep came not when you were ready, but when the world decided it was time. By day, the cottage was small. But by night, it became smaller. When the fire had died low, when the tools were hung and the last scraps of bread scraped into hungry mouths, the single-room home of a medieval peasant family transformed into something else entirely. A dormitory, a shelter, a livestock pen, and a very slow, very crowded snoring contest. Beds, in the modern sense, didn't belong to individuals. They belonged to households, and most households had one, maybe two. Children slept together, limbs tangled and noses red from the cold. Parents lay side by side when they could, or opposite one another if someone had a toothache and needed to breathe uphill. Grandparents were often kept closest to the fire, not from sentimentality, but because they'd die first if they froze. Babies were wherever they could fit. usually cradled beside the mother, sometimes in a sling wrapped tight, and occasionally nudged gently out of the way to make room for someone even smaller, a piglet. Because pigs gave off astonishing heat, and when it came to surviving the night, you chose warmth over hygiene every single time. Some families were large, 6, 10, 12 people, and all of them slept in the same room, on the same floor, under the same roof, sometimes under the same blanket. Which, of course, led to negotiation. Who got the edge? Who was always cold? Who kicked in their sleep? And who kept tucking their feet under your thighs for warmth like some kind of human ferret? And then, there were the animals. Chickens slept in boxes by the door, or perched on rafters above. Goats were tethered in corners. A donkey might poke its nose in from the lean-to, steam rising from its breath like a ghost in the dark. The presence of animals was never questioned. If it walked and gave off body heat, it was invited. In winter, the room held its heat like a badly sealed oven, warm at midnight, freezing by dawn, with your own breath curling back into your face like a silent reminder that you were, somehow, still alive. But let's not romanticize this. It smelled. Not just like wood smoke and wet wool, but like everything a family of 12 and 6 animals emits during the course of 24 hours. There was no chimney, just a hole in the roof, if you were lucky. Smoke clung to the thatch. Urine steamed in corners. Lice moved freely from head to head like gossip. And speaking of bodily needs, let's talk about the chamber pot. Not so much a convenience as it was a necessity with a handle. This humble object sat quietly beneath the bed, beside the hearth, or sometimes just a little too close to your face for comfort. Made from clay, wood, or tin, depending on what you could find or barter, it was, in essence, a bucket with a career. And it was used by everyone. Man, woman, child, noble, peasant, and the occasional goat if no one was watching. Privacy? Not really. In a one-room cottage, nobody turned away. You might shuffle over to the pot in the dark, lifting your shift or unlacing your trousers, while pretending no one could hear you. They could. And they would remember. If you think your uncle snoring in the guest room is disruptive, imagine trying to drift off while your cousin relieves himself into a wooden bowl 2 feet from your head. And then puts it back under the bed, with zero remorse. In noble households, things were marginally better, at least in theory. Some castles had guardrobes built into the stone, vertical shafts that emptied into moats or pits below. But the draft that came up through those chutes in winter was enough to freeze your backside solid. And so most lords and ladies used chamber pots, too. Porcelain if you were lucky, pewter if you were rich, and whatever the maid could find if you were someone's inconvenient guest. A servant, of course, would empty it in the morning. Another reason to always treat the help kindly. Back in the peasant home, the pot wasn't always emptied immediately. Sometimes it sat until morning. And sometimes it tipped. Which meant someone, usually the smallest child or the deepest sleeper, would awaken to a very unpleasant mystery. And then there were the bugs. Fleas were omnipresent. Lice, inevitable. Bedbugs? So common they didn't even have their own insult. A child waking with bites wasn't pitied, they were simply scratched, scolded, and sent back to the same straw. Mother combed nits out of hair by firelight, the same way she picked stones from lentils. One task among many. No one screamed. No one complained. It was just the way things were. The room was never quiet, either. Even in sleep, people muttered, coughed, snored like old oxen. The animals stirred. Someone farted, and someone else blamed it on the pig. You'd shift, roll, curl into the warm patch left by a sibling's back. And when you finally slept, you slept deeply. Not peacefully, but completely. Because your body had no choice. And in the morning, well, you'd stretch, groan, scratch at something itchy, and crawl back into your shoes before the rats carried them away. If the peasants slept crowded, itchy, and cold, the nobility, well, they slept slightly less crowded, marginally less itchy, and just as cold. only with better furniture. To walk into a noble bedchamber at night was to step into a space that tried, very hard, to pretend the outside world didn't exist. The floors were covered in rushes or woven mats. The stone walls were hidden behind thick tapestries, not just for decoration, but to hold in what little heat had been coaxed from the hearth. And the centerpiece of the room, towering, four-posted, and slightly intimidating, was the bed itself. It stood tall off the floor, carved from heavy oak or walnut, polished smooth and designed to impress. You didn't just climb into it, you ascended, often with the help of a footstool. The mattress, if you were wealthy enough, was filled with feathers. Light, yielding, and filled with the kind of down that only came from geese who had no idea what was coming. The sheets were linen, smooth, cool, sometimes embroidered with initials or family crests, in case you forgot whose bed you were freezing in. Blankets were wool, woven thick, sometimes layered with furs or imported silks. On the best nights, a fire burned low in the hearth nearby. On the worst nights, the fire was out, and you could see your own breath swirling above the pillow. But the real jewel of the noble bed was the canopy, an overhead frame from which hung curtains. Heavy ones. Sometimes velvet, sometimes wool, but always thick enough to trap heat and keep out the endless draft that whistled through medieval castles like a bored ghost. At night, the curtains were drawn tight, creating a kind of private, padded cocoon where one could pretend, briefly, to be alone. And that privacy was an illusion, of course. Most noble women didn't sleep alone. They might have a husband beside them, or a child, or a maid sleeping at the foot of the bed, ready to fetch something if needed. And if they were unmarried, they might share the space with a sister, a cousin, or an aging aunt who talked in her sleep. Still, compared to peasant life, noble sleep was almost luxurious. Almost. Of course, nobles had their own rituals. They didn't just fall into bed. There were preparations. Hair to be brushed, sometimes 100 strokes, depending on superstition or vanity. Hands to be washed with rose water. Stockings to be removed. Prayers to be whispered from bedposts carved to look like saints or swords. And warmth? That was a full-time job. A servant might heat a brick by the fire, wrap it in cloth, and slip it under the sheets before their master arrived. Others used bed warmers, long-handled pans filled with glowing coals, passed beneath the blankets like a polite threat to the cold. And some noble women slept with small dogs, not for companionship, but because a lap-sized animal with a warm belly was preferable to freezing to death in your own chamber. But don't be fooled. A feather bed was no guarantee of peace. The curtains trapped heat, but also smells. The mattress shifted with every movement. And while lice were more common in straw, they didn't exactly skip the aristocracy. In fact, they rather enjoyed the linen sheets. Then there were the sounds. A castle was not quiet at night. Wind howled through arrow slits. Servants moved through corridors. Guards clanked their way up and down stone stairs. And somewhere, always, there was a door that wouldn't stop creaking. Still, there were perks. A noble could ring for assistance. Whisper a request and have it fulfilled. Ask someone else to empty the chamber pot, which was present, yes, tucked discreetly behind a tapestry or screen, and used far more often than anyone liked to admit. Especially during long winter nights when even the idea of stepping onto a cold stone floor felt like a betrayal. And of course, you had space. No piglets. No cousins. No one rolling into your spine because someone else stole the blanket. Just you, your heavy curtains, your dog heater, and a vague hope that no one would call for you before sunrise. And yet, sleep did not always come easy. For all their tapestries and prayers, noblemen and noblewomen carried burdens of their own. Land disputes. Inheritance battles. Marriages arranged without love. Children buried too young. Enemies both distant and close. At least a peasant could collapse from exhaustion. The nobility had time to lie awake, staring into the canopy, listening to the sound of their own thoughts echo inside the dark. Because whether you slept on straw or feather, with pigs or poodles, sleep never asked about your title. It came when it pleased, stayed if it wanted, and left you just as tired either way. Somewhere in the dark, after the fire has burned down, after the last cough has quieted, after the piglet at your feet has stopped kicking, your eyes drift closed. And that was the first sleep. In the Middle Ages, people didn't sleep in one long stretch. They didn't expect to. In fact, sleeping 8 hours in a single uninterrupted block would have seemed suspicious, like something a rich person or a lazy monk might do. For everyone else, sleep came in 2 parts, first sleep and second sleep, with a waking period in between. A quiet hour, or sometimes more, where the world stood still but the mind did not. Most people would fall asleep not long after sundown. Especially in winter, that could mean crawling into bed by 7 or 8 p.m., wrapped in cloaks or tangled up in your entire family's feet. After a long day of physical labor or social maneuvering, sleep came easily. The body simply gave out. But somewhere around midnight, your eyes opened. Not sharply. Not with panic. Just open. As if your body had decided, that's enough for now. Let's think about things. And everyone expected this. It wasn't strange. It wasn't a disorder. It was just what the night did. There was even a word for it in several languages, the watch. In medical texts and prayer books alike, this middle hour of the night was referenced as a natural time for activity, reflection, and, in some cases, mischief. What did people do between their 2 sleeps? Well, whatever they could manage quietly. And not just adults, children, too, grew up with this rhythm baked into their nights. Little ones didn't need to be taught to wake at midnight. They just did. If you slept in the same room, under the same blanket, and breathed the same smoky air, your body learned the same patterns. Babies woke up to nurse. Toddlers stirred and rolled onto someone's face. Older children sat up, whispered to a sibling, got scolded, and lay back down. And no one thought it was strange. Midnight was simply part of the night. And if the youngest among them didn't quite understand why it was happening, they'd learn soon enough. By about age 6, you were expected to follow the same rules as everyone else, including the ones no one explained. Some lay still, eyes open, listening. To the sound of the wind. To a restless child murmuring in a dream. To the slow crackle of dying embers. To the quiet thoughts that couldn't be heard during the clamor of day. Others got up. They might check on the fire, pushing coals together, or carefully banking them again under ash. Some took the opportunity to relieve themselves, yes, into the ever-present chamber pot, still unfortunately nearby. Others drank. A small cup of ale. A sip of watered wine. In some cases, warm milk infused with herbs, poppy, chamomile, valerian, a medieval version of melatonin, when you could afford it. Couples might speak. Whispered words shared beneath shared blankets. Sometimes it was the only private time they had, especially in a house crowded with children. In wealthier homes, spouses might call in a servant to stoke the fire, or fetch something small to eat. For many married couples, this middle night hour was considered ideal for conception. Physicians claimed the body was warm, the mind calm, and the womb most receptive after the first sleep. A very medieval kind of romance. Some people prayed. Especially in devout households, the waking hour was seen as a holy window, a time when the soul might be closer to God. In monasteries, monks rose deliberately for matins, the midnight prayer service, chanting softly in cold stone chapels while the rest of the world drifted. But not everyone used the hour for such sacred pursuits. In cities, the watchman made his rounds, and not everyone he passed was asleep. Women stepped quietly from their homes. Men slipped through side alleys. Lovers met, briefly, beneath cloaks. Thieves worked under cover of moonlight. Midwives were summoned. Doctors called. It was known that life didn't stop between sleeps. In fact, some believed that the truest things happened then, things done in secret, in whispers, in the blue half-light between waking and dreaming. There are even court records describing events that took place between the first and second sleep. It was a legally recognized time of night. So much so that if someone committed a crime during that hour, it was sometimes treated differently. Because the world wasn't fully asleep, but it wasn't exactly awake either. You can imagine the arguments. And then, just as quietly as it came, the hour passed. The second sleep returned like a tide, slow and insistent. Your body, having stirred, now wanted to rest again. Not the light nap of dusk, but the deeper, heavier sleep that carried you toward dawn. If the first sleep was survival, the second was surrender. And so you'd curl back in, maybe closer to the fire this time, maybe having moved from one end of the shared mattress to another, now that someone had rolled away. The baby might fuss, but only briefly. The wind might rise, but you'd already drifted. And somehow, the second sleep was sweeter. Because the night had already shown its teeth, and found you still breathing. You'd faced the cold, the dark, your own thoughts, and now there was nothing left to do but let go. By the time the second sleep ended, the world was stirring again. Roosters crowed. Bells rang from distant towers. Servants tiptoed into chambers. Mothers stirred porridge. And your body, stiff from the mattress, sore from the cold, began the slow return to duty. Today, we call it insomnia. We call it a disorder. A problem to be solved. But in the Middle Ages, waking at midnight was simply part of the rhythm. A kind of internal candle, burning low, marking time. A space for the in-between, between work and rest, body and spirit, yesterday and tomorrow. And so, if you've ever found yourself lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, wondering what's wrong with you, perhaps there's nothing wrong at all. Perhaps some part of you remembers. The silence. The softness. The watch. And your mind is just keeping a promise your body forgot how to keep. Let's talk about pajamas. Or rather, let's talk about how they didn't exist. There were no dedicated sleepwear drawers in the Middle Ages. No soft cotton sets. No fuzzy socks. No satin robes to flutter around dramatically as you extinguished your candle. For most people, sleeping meant curling up in whatever you had worn all day, or, in some cases, nothing at all. Peasants, first of all, didn't have a change of clothes for every occasion. Most people owned one or two tunics, total, one to wear, one to wash, if they were lucky. Washing happened maybe once a week, and drying took time, especially in winter. So unless your clothes were soaked or crawling, you slept in them. Boots came off, of course, and maybe a belt. But everything else stayed on: shift, tunic, hose, head wrap, simply because removing layers meant exposing yourself to the kind of night air that could turn your breath into frost. And if you had lice, which, let's be honest, you did, removing clothing also meant liberating them. Which no one wanted. Now, some peasants did undress, especially in the summer, when even wool couldn't soak up all the sweat you poured out during the day. In these cases, you might sleep in your linen undershift, or just a cloth around the waist. And yes, sometimes, nothing. Especially for young men, or in homes where everyone had already seen everything, sleeping naked was not particularly scandalous. Cold? Yes. Scandalous? No. But this lack of clothing made sharing a bed even more complicated, especially when the bed was already full. "Sorry, that's just my leg," became a very popular sentence, followed closely by, "No, that one's mine." For women, the story changed slightly, but not much. Most slept in their undershift, a long, rough linen garment worn beneath the dress during the day. It wasn't designed for elegance. It was designed to catch sweat and oil so your outer clothing didn't rot. But it doubled as sleepwear. You might keep your head covered, too, with a cloth or coif, not for modesty, but because heat escapes through the top, and every bit mattered. And then there was the nightcap. Not the boozy kind. The fabric kind. That iconic little hat tied under the chin in every medieval painting of bedtime. They really wore them. Not because they looked fetching, they absolutely didn't, but because cold air settled on the head like a jealous ghost. And when you sleep with your face exposed to stone walls and winter winds, a bit of cloth could mean the difference between waking up groggy and waking up frozen. Plus, for the lice, it worked as a soft little prison, which felt like justice. Children, too, slept in shifts or tunics. There were no animal print pajamas. No footed harnesses. Just miniature versions of adult clothes, or no clothes at all. If you were a child lucky enough to sleep near your mother, she might tuck you under her arm, shift and all. If you weren't, you learned quickly how to make a warm shape out of nothing. Curled legs, hidden hands, the back of your sister's knees for heat. Now, in noble homes, the options widened a little. Noble women might own a bedgown, or a loose woolen robe to wear over their linen shift. These were rare and considered a luxury, often embroidered, sometimes dyed rich colors, worn more for status than comfort. You weren't expected to sweat in it. Just exist softly until morning. For men, there were long shirts, simple but tailored, sometimes belted loosely around the waist if someone might see them. You had to look dignified, even half asleep. But most nobles still didn't have full nightwear sets. What they had was a layering system: shift, overshift, robe, maybe a fur, maybe a blanket worn like a cape as they drifted from fire to bed and back again. Because even with wealth, you still had to fight the cold. A castle at night was not warm. Stone walls held the chill like a promise. You might sleep in linen, but you'd drape yourself in pelts, blankets, woolen cloaks, anything that held the day's heat. And if you had a servant, they might warm the bed for you first with a pan of coals. Or, if you were really lucky, they'd crawl in first and heat it with their body. This was not considered romantic. Of course, no one talked about fashion at bedtime. No one judged your style. But modesty, especially in noble circles, still mattered. If someone walked in unexpectedly, which happened more than you'd think, you were expected to appear presentable. Not fully dressed, but not scandalous either. Which meant always keeping something within reach. A wrap. A robe. A heavy curtain you could dive behind if needed. It wasn't about vanity. It was about propriety, and the delicate art of pretending you didn't just drool on your linen pillow. And when all was said and done, when you were tucked in, bound up in wool and linen and furs and maybe a small dog, there was only one more thing to do: pray you didn't have to get up again. Because standing barefoot on a stone floor at 2 a.m. while trying to untie your nightcap and find the chamber pot in the dark? No layer of fabric could prepare you for that. Let's not be poetic about it. Winter was awful. There's no soft way to put it. It didn't come with twinkle lights, cinnamon candles, or fleece-lined pajamas. It came with fog in your lungs, ice in your hair, and the sensation that your knees had turned to wood before you even laid down. And in the Middle Ages, especially in Northern Europe, winter wasn't just cold. It was long, bitter, and personal. The kind of cold that crept through stone, chewed through wool, and made you question every decision that led to you being born in a house with no chimney. So, how did people sleep through it? The short answer is, they got extremely creative. The long answer? Let's take it slowly. Because if you've ever sat in a cold room and wondered how to warm your toes without standing up, you might find some solidarity here. In a peasant's cottage, the fire was everything. It sat in the center of the room, not just for cooking, but for life support. Before bed, the last person awake, often the mother, sometimes a child guilt-tripped into staying up, would gather the embers into a tight pile, cover them with ash, and bank the fire. This helped it smolder slowly overnight, ready to be coaxed back to life in the morning. If the fire went out, well, let's just say mornings were louder. With no central heating, the entire house relied on whatever residual heat clung to the stones, the bodies, and the breath trapped in the rafters. Everyone slept as close to the hearth as possible, which meant arguments over placement. The baby usually won, followed by grandma, then whichever child had a cough. If you were healthy, young, and least likely to die of hypothermia, you got the outer edge. Congratulations. But even near the fire, the cold seeped in. There were no sealed windows. No insulation. Just wood slats or wattle and daub, and gaps between everything. Wind found you. It always did. You'd pull your blanket up. Tuck your cloak tighter. Curl your feet under someone else's thighs and pretend it was an accident. Most were wool, scratchy, patched, and thin by the end of the season. Some families laid old cloaks, animal hides, or even damp-smelling sacks on top for warmth. And of course, you shared them. One blanket for 4 people. Someone always hogged it. Someone always gave up and slept in their coat. And speaking of coats, if you had a second tunic, or an outer layer, you kept it on. Or rolled it into a lump to use as a pillow. Or wrapped it around your feet. If you had straw boots, you might even sleep in those. Not because it was comfortable, but because numb feet were easier to ignore than frostbite. In some regions, peasants used bedstones, large river stones heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth. These were tucked under the blanket near the feet, assuming you trusted your cloth not to ignite. If you didn't have a stone, you could use a brick, a metal pan of coals, or, in some cases, a living animal. Yes, an actual animal. Pigs were best, for warmth and surface area. Dogs worked if you were lucky enough to have one. Even chickens, believe it or not, were held under arms or tucked near legs. Anything with a pulse and body heat qualified as a sleeping companion. And once you'd slept with a pig pressed to your ribs for 3 months, no future partner could ever truly compare. Nobles, for all their wealth, weren't much better off. Sure, they had feather beds, tapestries on the walls, fireplaces in the chambers. But castle stone absorbed cold like a secret, and kept it. A fire might blaze bright in the evening, but by 3 a.m., it was just an echo of warmth and the faint smell of ash. So, noble households prepared. A servant would heat a pan of coals, place it in a long-handled warmer, and sweep it under the covers before their master arrived. It was a delicate process. Move too fast, and you scorched the sheets. Move too slow, and the pan smoked. Either way, the servant usually got blamed. The truly lucky had warming bricks, ceramic or soapstone, heated and wrapped in cloth, placed at the foot of the bed. But even then, the warmth didn't last. Curtains around the bed helped. Heavy drapes held in the air, muffled the wind, and gave the illusion of a personal microclimate. But here's the uncomfortable truth: everyone still froze. Nobles, peasants, monks, merchants, no one slept warm all winter. They just got used to being cold. They wrapped and laid and burrowed and begged the fire to hold on. They rubbed hands, tucked ears, and wore hats to bed with no sense of irony. Some even slept sitting up, because lying down made the blood settle strangely, and breathing cold air directly felt like swallowing snow. And still, frost formed on the inside of the walls. On blankets. On shoes. On hair. People woke up with ice in their beards. Children clung to their mothers and whispered about death. Old men didn't wake at all. But most did. And when they did, they groaned, they stretched, they smacked their arms to bring the feeling back, and they did it all again the next night. So yes, winter was a beast. And sleep was a battle. You fought it not with comfort, but with habit. With proximity. With whatever your hands could gather before the dark came. You slept because there was nothing else to do. And you prayed that your toes, and your fire, would still be there in the morning. If you've ever woken in the middle of the night to a dripping faucet, a creaking pipe, or the cat knocking something off the shelf, you're in good company. Medieval people, for all their wool and wood and stone, slept with noise. Constant, unpredictable, and inescapable noise. Because the truth is, there was no such thing as silence in the medieval world. Not the way we imagine it. Not the kind you can buy with double-paned windows and noise-canceling headphones. At best, you had quiet. At worst, you had an entire acoustic ecosystem sharing your room, your roof, and sometimes your bed. Let's begin in the peasant cottage, where most people lived and slept. You'd hear the fire settle, the soft collapse of coals, the whisper of ash shifting. You'd hear the wind moaning through the thatch, nudging loose shutters, sneaking in under doors like an uninvited ghost. But that was just background. The real music came from the living things. A child rolled over and grunted. Someone muttered in their sleep. Someone else scratched, loudly, at a flea bite. A chicken clucked softly in its dreams. A pig snorted once and went quiet. Someone exhaled in that long, rattly way that made you think they might be dying, until they turned over and did it again. Snores, of course, were unavoidable. Some were soft and breathy, a faint flutter at the edge of hearing. Others were aggressive. Purposeful. The kind of snore that changed pitch halfway through, or paused dramatically, like it wanted to make sure you were listening. And if you've never tried to sleep 2 feet from your brother, your grandmother, and a farting goat, well, let's just say there's a reason people aged quickly. Then there were the pests. Rats were common, bold, clever, and rarely quiet. They ran along the beams at night, tiny claws clicking like drumsticks. They knocked things over. They nested in straw. Some families hung their food from the ceiling, not to keep it cool, but to keep it uneaten. It didn't always work. Mice squeaked. Insects chirped. And once in a while, something scratched from inside the wall, just loud enough to make you question your choices. Or your sanity. And yet, somehow, people slept. Not deeply. Not peacefully. But often, and completely, because the body will rest when it's exhausted, even if the air is full of snoring and scratching and someone talking in their sleep about fish. In noble homes, the sounds were different. Not better. Just, wealthier. The fire crackled in the hearth, fed by oak logs rather than twigs. A dog might snore gently at the foot of the bed. Somewhere down the corridor, a servant sneezed and tried not to make a sound. The curtains around your bed muffled the room, but not completely. You still heard the wind. You still heard the wood creak, old beams flexing, as if trying to remember a different shape. And then, the bells. If you lived near a monastery, or inside a walled town, you'd hear them all night. Soft, rolling, solemn. Bells marked the hours, not for you, but for the monks. Matins, around midnight. Lauds, just before dawn. Some churches rang on the quarter hour. Some waited longer. But either way, they stitched the night together with quiet reminders that time was passing, even if you were not. Some people found the bells comforting. Others cursed them. But no one ignored them. You might also hear footsteps, soft, deliberate, muffled by rushes. A servant passing through with a chamber pot. A guard shifting his weight at the door. In castles, the sound of someone walking in the night was not always cause for alarm, but it was never a good sign either. Then there were the strange sounds. A groan from the walls, just the wind. Probably. A knock at the shutters, just a bird. Hopefully. A distant wail, just a fox. Or something worse. And always, the sound of your own breath. Shallow. Cold. Condensing on linen. Reminding you that you were alive. And that the night wasn't over. But perhaps the most human sound of all, was breathing. Your own. Theirs. Dozens of lungs in sync or at odds. Breath as heat. Breath as rhythm. Breath as proof that someone was still there. In communal sleep, you became hyper-aware of the people around you. You learned to recognize their sighs. Their coughs. The way someone sniffled before turning over. The tiny squeak your sister's elbow made against the wooden bench. The particular grunt your father gave when the fire popped. In a world without white noise machines, sleep was shared listening. You didn't block the sounds out. You adapted to them. Made space for them. Folded your own breath around them. And over time, those sounds became the lullaby. A strange, imperfect, rustling music. Full of shifting weight, whispered prayers, and the unmistakable sound of life continuing, poorly, loudly, but faithfully, through the longest nights. You'd think sleep would be a relief. After a day of aching backs, cold feet, and small disappointments, after pulling lice from your child's hair and scraping the burnt bits off the porridge, you'd think lying down in the dark would feel like safety. Like mercy. But in the Middle Ages, sleep came with risks. Not just cold. Not just discomfort. But something deeper. Stranger. More spiritual. Because while your body lay still, something else might be moving. To a medieval mind, sleep wasn't just physical. It was a crossing. A time when the soul wandered, when demons crept closer, when the boundary between this world and the next grew thin enough to let things through. If you died in your sleep, and many did, people didn't call it peaceful. They called it sudden. They said your soul had been taken. That you were visited by something. Or someone. Or that you simply didn't fight hard enough to return. And so, bedtime came with ritual. Children were taught to say their prayers, even if they couldn't remember all the words. Adults crossed themselves before laying down. Candles were snuffed with intention, not just for safety, but as a signal, this is my last act, in case I don't wake. And they meant it. But even if you didn't die, there were still dangers. Dreams weren't just dreams. They were messages. Warnings. Or, worse, visitations. In Christian households, a vivid dream could be a sign from God. Or a test. Or, if it involved anything too vivid or strange, a possible temptation from the devil. If you dreamed of someone who had died, it might mean they were trapped in purgatory and needed prayers. If you dreamed of your neighbor, it might mean they were thinking impure thoughts about you. Or that you were thinking them, and your subconscious had just tattled. Then there was the matter of nightmares. Not just bad dreams, but the real, visceral kind. The kind that made your chest seize. That pinned your arms. That filled the room with something you couldn't quite see. Today, we call it sleep paralysis. Back then, it was called a night hag. A malevolent force that sat on your chest and tried to steal your breath. Or worse, your soul. People reported waking, frozen, eyes wide open, unable to move or cry out. A weight pressed down on them. A shape in the corner. A feeling of doom. And no, they weren't making it up. They were experiencing real symptoms, but without science to explain them, they turned to spirit. And spirits, after all, needed rules. To ward off the night hag, some families placed iron tools near the bed, knives, nails, shears, not to use, but to protect. Others said you should sleep on your side, or with your arms crossed. Some women wore charms or saint medallions. Some men recited protective verses. And some just hoped she'd pass them over and visit someone else. Then there were the witches. Not broomstick riding, wart-nosed fairy tales, but real women, often midwives or healers, accused of entering dreams. Causing impotence. Stealing milk. Cursing a neighbor's child from miles away, all while the village slept. If you woke up sick, or sore, or scared, you might blame her. If you woke up pregnant, and unmarried, you might be her. Fear of the supernatural wasn't reserved for villages. Even monks recorded strange dreams. Even queens consulted mystics. Sleep made everyone vulnerable. It leveled the field. In some cases, you didn't even need to sleep to be afraid. Just hearing someone mutter in their sleep was enough to make a family nervous. They might be speaking to spirits. Or cursing the house. Or revealing secrets they didn't know they knew. Children were told not to talk after dark. Women were warned against sleeping with their mouths open. The devil, they said, entered through breath. And still, people slept. Because they had to. Because the body demanded it, even when the mind resisted. And because not sleeping brought its own kind of madness, hallucinations, fevers, sudden violence. Better to face the night, demons and all, than to live without rest. So they made peace with the dark. They whispered protection. They trusted in prayer, in habit, in the nearness of others. A warm body beside you was more than comfort. It was witness. If something came for you in the night, at least someone would see it. Or, see that you were gone. And perhaps that's why medieval sleep was so deeply communal. Not just for warmth, or space, or tradition, but for survival. Physical, emotional, spiritual. A room full of snoring, shifting, breathing bodies meant you were not alone. That the night was held, gently, by many. That whatever came through the dark, had to pass through all of you. So if you've ever felt something heavy in your chest when you wake, or dreamed of someone who wasn't supposed to be there, or whispered into the dark, just in case someone, or something, was listening, you're not alone. You never were. Because in the long cold hours of medieval night, everyone feared what they couldn't see. But they faced it anyway. Under wall. Beneath prayer. Beside one another. And in the morning, whether they remembered the dream or not, they rose, stretched, and went to work. Because fear was part of the night. But so was getting up again. There's a moment, just before dawn, when the world isn't quite awake, but it isn't asleep anymore either. The fire is low, barely whispering. The frost has crept in, crisping the edges of the straw, curling against the windows. You can hear the breath of the people around you, long, slow, unconscious, like waves against a shore. And then, a sound breaks it. Not a bell. Not a rooster. Not even a cough. Just, the soft groan of someone shifting. The stretch of an arm. A blanket pulled tighter. And you know it's starting. Morning has come. Quietly. Uninvited. And far too soon. Waking in the Middle Ages wasn't sudden. There were no alarms. No buzzes. No bright rectangles to jolt you out of sleep. There was just the slow return of awareness, often unwelcome, always undeniable. If you were lucky, the fire still had life. A few glowing coals. A wisp of warmth. Enough to coax it back into something useful. Someone would rise first, often the mother, always the one with the most to do, and poke the ashes like a prayer, hoping they hadn't gone cold. If the fire was dead, the morning would be worse. Colder. Slower. Sharper in the bones. You'd open your eyes and see your own breath, misting the air just inches from your face. The blanket, if you had one, would be stiff at the edges. Your clothes, left too close to the wall, might be crusted with frost. And if you'd forgotten to bring your shoes in from the door? Well, they weren't shoes anymore. They were two frozen bricks shaped like regret. But still, you got up. Not all at once. First you Saturday. Let the blood return to your fingers. Rubbed your arms. Swung your legs out, slowly, hissing between your teeth. Rolled your shoulders. Blinked. Grunted. Then finally stood, a little hunched, a little sore, and began the day. The room was still crowded, but now with movement. Children stretching. Someone is coughing. Someone else muttered about how they didn't sleep. Someone kicked off a chicken that had somehow made it onto the bed. The chamber pot got used. Possibly tipped. Definitely blamed on someone else. There was no talking at first, just small noises. Hands patting down tunics. Feet scraping into stiff boots. A few grunts of recognition. A shared glance that meant, another night survived. Outside, the world was waking too. The air was gray. Birds complained. A dog barked at nothing. In towns, church bells tolled, not for beauty, but for routine. Time to rise. Time to move. Time to work. In noble homes, mornings were only slightly more graceful. A servant might arrive with warm water. Curtains drawn back. A polite cough to signal their presence. If the lady of the house stirred, she'd be helped to sit. If she didn't, the servant waited, not out of courtesy, but calculation. The fire in the hearth was either roaring, thanks to preparation, or gone. If it was gone, someone would be scolded. If roaring, someone was probably tipped in coin or kindness. Dressing began slowly. Linen shift. Overdress. Laces. Layer after layer until the body felt upright again. Hair was brushed. Lips wiped. Hands inspected for cracks, cuts, anything that might require a balm. Not for vanity, but function. Because even the rich had to face the cold. And they faced it standing up, with stiff knees and half-frozen stockings. There was no coffee. No quiet moment at the kitchen table with birdsong and toast. Breakfast was whatever could be warmed, found, or chewed. Porridge. Leftover bread. Dried beans if someone was already boiling the pot. And as you stood, chewing, you could already feel the fatigue waiting for you at the end of the next day. You hadn't really recovered. No one did. Sleep wasn't restorative. It was maintenance. Just enough to keep your legs from giving out during the afternoon chores. But still, you rose. Because the cow needed milking. Because the bread wouldn't bake itself. Because someone had to go chop more wood, and that someone was always you. And when you stepped outside, into the damp, heavy dawn, you didn't think about the night before. Or the dreams you couldn't remember. Or the lice you were pretending not to have. You just squinted against the light. And moved forward. Because night would come again. And with it, the same hard mattress. The same shifting breath. The same silent fears. The same fire you'd have to build, again. And again. But for now, you were up. The day had begun. And sleep, cold, crowded, and imperfect, had done its job. It had carried you through the dark. And brought you back to morning. And now, you know how they slept. Under shared blankets, beside snoring uncles, across lumpy straw mattresses and creaking wooden frames. In castles and cottages, through firelight and frostbite, dreams and dread. They folded themselves into wool, into prayer, into habit. They woke twice a night, feared what came between, and still, every evening, they lay back down. Because sleep was never perfect. Not then. Not now. But it was necessary. A pause in the long labor of being alive. And maybe tonight, as you settle deeper into your own blankets, with your own familiar aches, you'll feel the quiet kinship of history. You've had sleepless nights. So did they. You've whispered to the dark. So did they. You've longed for rest that truly restores. And so did they. If you're listening in bed with tired eyes and an overthinking brain, you're in the right place. So let this story carry you. And if you're still awake at the end, I'll be here to say goodnight. Script written by Clara Finch. Because some stories still deserve a soul. Good night.